President.
Let's see. President DeYeso, Jason, Mrs. Templeton, Reverend Marrero, ladies and gentlemen, I truly appreciate this opportunity tonight to be part of the Medal of Honor ceremony and program and dinner in support of Freedom's Foundation education programs. As President DeYeso said, I have participated in programs here at the Freedom's Foundation. I have truly enjoyed that. As a citizen, I am grateful for the service that Freedom's Foundation provides for our community and for our nation. And as a person, I am proud of my association with this foundation. Dwight Eisenhower was a founder of the Freedom's Foundation back in 1949. My father, John Eisenhower, was executive vice president of the Freedom's Foundation in the mid-1960s. I think that people in the audience would be interested to know that in one of my last conversations with my father, the subject of Freedom's Foundation came up, and the fact that I would be participating in one of the teacher institutes at the foundation. And he said, you know, take that very seriously, he said to me, because the work of the Freedom's Foundation today, this was 2013, might be more important than it was in my time. And he was referring to the mid-1960s. In my father's time, Americans were close to the war. Americans were close to the Depression. The responsibilities of citizenship were something that were understood by Americans almost naturally, in second nature. The significance of America and the significance of our international mission was second nature to most Americans. The currents of patriotism were very strong in American life in the early 1960s. And things have changed. We live in a different world today, and as a result, the importance of the work done by this foundation has perhaps even increased over the years. It is a pleasure to be here tonight with Dr. Alan Lee, my friend from University of Pennsylvania, Professor Roger Smith, who is here with his brother Chris, and his neighbor Pat, a West Point graduate. It is a pleasure to be with them. Roger's brother, Chris, is described as a history aficionado, and among other things, in finding out that Rogers was going to be here, he's a big part of the Freedom's Foundation. I find out that his brother has been to Normandy a number of times. By coincidence, in 72 hours, that's exactly where I will be. I'm about to get on an airplane and fly to Normandy, where I will greet people coming in on a cruise and lead them on what can only be described, and Rogers in his email described his brother's trips to Normandy as a pilgrimage. I think that from time to time, in this day and age, in the new era that we live in now, it is perhaps required of American citizens to take time out and to make an effort to visit places and shrines to our nation and to its ideals. That is part of the secret of Freedom's Foundation and part of the significance of this entire program, the location. My grandfather felt, in fact, my father said this many times, but Dwight Eisenhower felt that in America there were three sacred locations. One being Gettysburg, another being West Point, and a third being Valley Forge. By bringing students and teachers here, the Freedom's Foundation is bringing Americans to the place where the American miracles of independence and the Constitution happened over 200 years ago. And to do this is inspirational. Going on location anywhere inspires. It also teaches. I think of all the trips that my father and I took to battlefields when I was a boy. I can remember our last trip to battlefields in France to see American battlefields in World War I. And I can remember how much we learned from these things, from going on location. We'll be in Normandy in 72 hours. And in Normandy, one can actually picture the scenes that we will see. One can try to imagine what conditions were like on June 6, 1944. As many times as a resident growing up in Gettysburg, I have imagined what the day must have been like on July 3, 1863, when William Pickett's division crosses the point at Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, one of the most amazing 45 minutes in American history. We will stand in the Normandy Cemetery And not only will we be inspired, and not only will we learn by seeing the terrain, we will also be moved to think of the significance, the deep spiritual significance of the meaning of America and our involvement abroad and our conflicts and our great story at home. We will stand in the cemetery of Normandy, and I have done that a number of times. The first time I did it, I was called upon to speak, and I was moved by an association that actually took me by surprise, and that was part of this trip that my father and I took to eastern France when we visited the Pennsylvania National Guard Cemetery, which was very close to the Meuse-Argonne area where American forces entered in strength in World War I. What I told the people standing in the Omaha Cemetery, this is 5 years ago, I asked them to look around themselves and to understand and to appreciate the beauty of their surroundings. And I said that my father and I stood in the Pennsylvania National Guard Cemetery in the Meuse-Argonne, and we were surrounded by similar beauty. And what was interesting is that we were the only people there, the only people in that entire place. And we were surrounded by beauty that was comparable to the beauty that we were seeing at Omaha Beach. I think that is significant. It must be some consolation for families who lost people in the war to understand that whether a site is visited or whether a site is not visited, that if you fall in the service of the United States of America, you will always be in the loving embrace of your country. Similarly, here in Valley Forge, it is only here that I think that people can walk these acres and can imagine the privations that Americans suffered during the most important winter in the history of our republic. Only here in the Medal of Honor garden can people be assured, Americans can be assured, whether this garden is visited or whether it is not visited, they can be assured that a memorial is being maintained to our Medal of Honor winners with the respect and the reverence that the symbolic significance of that decoration means for America. Summing up, an experience here, which Freedom's Foundation makes possible, is direct experience. And because it is direct experience, it is lasting. I'm also pleased to be here tonight with Mrs. Templeton. We admire the work of the Templeton Foundation, which advances research into big ideas. It's one of the most interesting foundations I've ever read about. Big ideas like creativity and freedom and gratitude, love, purpose, infinity, time, curiosity, and purpose. This is what brings Freedom's Foundation and Templeton Foundation together, because we examine at Freedom's Foundation big ideas. Courage is a big idea. Civic virtue is a big thing. And on these things, Templeton and the Freedom's Foundation, I think very, very closely. One, the Freedom's Foundation believes that the behaviors and the attitudes that are associated with civic virtues can be defined. Second, that civic virtues can be learned. And this is the important point about the education programs here. Civic virtues can be learned. Courage is a civic virtue, of course. In the shadow of the Medal of Honor garden, people can contemplate the example of our Medal of Honor winners who went above and beyond the call of duty, and to consider the extraordinary circumstances they faced and the ordinary challenges that we face in everyday life, and the obligation to daily carry out acts of honesty and respect and responsibility and compassion in our daily lives. The Freedom's Foundation provides a perfect setting to learn about these virtues and to learn about their realities, what they mean, and how they are applied. If the 10 Amendments to our Constitution define liberty, if the 10 Commandments define our relationship with our Creator, an innovation at the Freedom's Foundation, the Bill of Responsibilities, is a code of civic virtue. Now, I've studied this code very, very carefully, and I find that it really forms sort of two clusters. So one cluster is one's relationship with the community, being a good neighbor. The other cluster of rights and responsibilities seem to deal with becoming a better person. I think this is a fascinating innovation, and it is something that really is a signature innovation of the Freedom's Foundation. thinking of these things, I think back on the examples. We all learn from examples, and I think back on a founder of this organization, and that is my grandfather. What I know about citizenship, what I know about obligations, so on, I learned a great deal of this with him. Rights and responsibilities. My grandfather was the first ever to hire me for a job. He hired me as a worker on the farm, and I can remember the pride that I felt in receiving a paycheck, 25 cents an hour. When I was about 8 years old, he was the first to fire me. In the summer of 1963, I can remember lingering over a lunch hour a little too long and playing cards. We thought the general was downtown. We had no idea he was on the grounds of the farm. He walked through the door. I don't remember what he said particularly, but I can still see him, and I knew that I was out of a job. I also knew that I had a golf date with him that afternoon, and I wasn't sure whether he was going to arrive and show up for that, but at 4 o'clock he turned up. We drove in silence to the golf course. My grandfather and me, we played the first hole in silence, the second hole in silence, the third hole in silence. Finally, on the fourth hole, another lesson of, I would say, civic virtue. He says, David, you know, I allow my associates one mistake a year, and you've had yours. And on the fifth hole, I was rehired. Proving a civic virtue of forgiveness, to err is human and to forgive divine. My grandfather taught me to improve myself. Dwight Eisenhower, a founding member of Freedom's Foundation, was somebody who improved himself in every way possible. He was actually not Dwight David Eisenhower. I think people would be interested to know that. He was David Dwight Eisenhower. When he arrived at West Point in June of 1911, he changed his first, middle, and first names because he liked the sound of Dwight David better than the sound of David Dwight, so he improved his name. He registered as being born in Tyler, Texas, instead of Denison, Texas, apparently because it's better to be from Tyler. And so he improved his birthplace. He is somebody that neglected items of his history, such as playing professional baseball in the KOM League in 1909 and 1910, which would have meant his eligibility at football. But these are things that improved him. But I think that there is a larger moral, and it is a moral that bears on civic responsibility. That, by the way, was very typical of Americans at the turn of the century, in the early 20th century. You changed your name, birth records were not accurate, this and that. But what matters in America is not who you are, but what you become. And Dwight Eisenhower, over the course of a long career in public service, proved, it seems to me, what you can become in the form of an ideal citizen. In the Eisenhower era, love of country was a given, and love of country inevitably is a question mark today. Rogers and Allen and I work with students at University of Pennsylvania, and I think I speak for them when I say today, people that we come into contact with are good, great people. We have great students. They're diligent, they're honest, they're public service minded. But public service how? Public service why? Public service when? No one seems to know. Our encounters with students raise the question whether our culture adequately conveys what America means, its uniqueness and its significance in the world. This is a question which has assumed a fair amount of urgency because we now live in a globalized world, and globalization is here to stay. And globalization comes with ideas and suggestions that the significance of nations has been diminished. And yet I'm also mindful of another sacred place in America, and that is Gettysburg. And I'm mindful of the conflict that was part of. Americans fought, and this is an astounding event in American history, a great civil war to define the size and the character of America and to cleanse ourselves so that we could be of benefit to the world. The theme of world and nation appears in one of the most interesting speeches that I've encountered as a professor at Penn, and that is Ulysses Grant's inaugural in 1869, 4 years after the American Civil War. He remarks, as the victorious general of that conflict, "The young men of the country, they who from their age must be its rulers 25 years hence, have a peculiar interest in maintaining the national honor. a moment's reflection as to what will be our commanding influence among the nations of the earth in their day, if they are only true to themselves, should inspire them with national pride. As Dwight Eisenhower would remind Americans 80 years later, after all, we are part of a globalized era, but what we would wish to come to pass in the world must first come to pass in the heart of America. We are citizens of the world generally, but we are citizens of America specifically. We have responsibility for ourselves. We share in humanity, but we have brothers and sisters, and those brothers and sisters are Americans, and we are our brothers' keepers. Today, Hamilton is a major phenomenon on Broadway. My daughter is directing 1776, which is showing at the Media Theater, and I think that the reappearance and the revival of these things, these testaments to our past and the era that Valley Forge represents, make us mindful of the challenge that America had. We are a democracy, and yet democracies are supposed to be short-lived. Democracies are supposedly appropriate only for small nations. We're a very large nation. America is defying odds, but we have defied odds for 200 years because of the qualities that are encouraged by a free society, specifically the qualities, the virtues of good citizenship. Building appreciation for them and the importance of our country is a work that never ends. We need this more than ever. Responsible citizens. We need political leaders who are willing to serve. We need entrepreneurs who are willing to innovate. We need young people who are dedicated to developing their talents for the benefit of all. But above all, we need responsible citizenship. That means we need Freedom's Foundation. We have Freedom's Foundation. I am proud it is here. I am glad it is here. I am grateful that it has involved me in its programs, but above all, as a citizen, I am grateful for the work that it does for our community and for our nation. Thank you very much.